Hi, everyone. I'm the co-chair also for this session, and I want to extend my appreciation to all of you again for being here. Maybe we'll make it a very intimate conversation and then see what Q&As come up after the end. But I'm going to start introducing the speakers. We're going to go in a slightly different order than what's listed in your program because one of our speakers has to catch a flight out. But I'm Gifted Kwashi. I'm a colorectal surgeon from University of Michigan, and I actually have the pleasure of introducing both the colorectal surgeons on the panel today. I should have brought my poop emojis to go over too. But our first speaker is going to be Dr. Anne Monjou. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Surgery at Yale University. Anne has a lot of extensive accolades, including she trained at Brigham in general surgery residency. She did have fellowship at Louisville, and she's going to be speaking to us on reprocessing of medical equipment as a sustainable supply alternative. So, Dr. Monjou.
All right. Ooh, there we go. Okay, let's see. All right, well, we have the title. All right, we'll count our 7 seconds. These are my disclosures. I like to play with this robot and try to encourage their engineers to make it better. All right. So when we think about medical device reprocessing, we think about our triangle, and I think about the aftermath of like my robotic cancer cases, and this is basically what the OR looks like. There are bags, there's blood, there's debris everywhere. But the reality is what's buried in those bags is some pretty valuable stuff. The Real has it right. Fashion is one of the most polluting industries, but healthcare is actually slightly more polluting than they are. As we were just talking about greenhouse gases, it's actually our supply chain is 80% of the greenhouse gases that we do as an economic sector. So really, what is it? It's not just washing a device. It's an entire circular life cycle when we reprocess something that's cleaning, reconditioning, function testing, and disinfection or sterilization, all with quality metrics that have to be met to get it back in a box again. We've been doing it for a while. In the 60s and 70s, devices had big lumens. They were made out of ceramics and stainless steels. They were easy to clean, so hospitals did that. Fast forward to the 70s and the 80s, we saw the advent of the single-use device, the linear take, make, waste pathway that sort of started to take over. We had better plastics. We had microcircuitry. Things were harder to clean and to re-sterilize. It was the start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and people were really concerned about effectively cleaning these smaller, harder to clean devices. So single use took over our hospital systems, and hospitals bought into this. And then, of course, became subject to their suppliers and then started to reprocess these single-use items. Maybe not the best idea, and the FDA actually stepped in 2000 with their first white paper on enforcement priorities for single-use devices and actually spelling out how to reprocess single-use devices. And the biggest thing to take away from this is that they basically pawned all the responsibility and the liability onto the reprocessor. So the initial manufacturer just has to make the device. It has to work one time, and they don't have to give you any idea how it can be cleaned or how it can be function tested. That all has to be done in a pre-market application by the reprocessors, and the pathway through it is actually really stringent. You may not realize it, but we're all using these devices in every hospital, military hospital, top U.S. hospital. They're there in one form or another, maybe not in the most expensive ways of keeping them out of the landfills, but they're there. What do we repurpose? Lots of things. We reprocess permanent devices. We won't talk about the single-use duodenoscopes, and disposable devices like my favorite ligature, which has a lot of equipment in it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So, but it's not just big devices, it's the common things, right? Like these are the things we have in our OR every single day, and we are just throwing them in the trash and they can be reprocessed. So this is the reprocessing that happened in 2020 in the US was enough to save 14.2 million pounds of waste by just recycling some of these low yield items like SCDs or stethoscopes or blood pressure cuffs. The market's pretty big. The conservative estimate in the US for 2024 is about $1 billion. If all the hospitals took it at the same rate as the highest recycling hospitals, it'd be about 2.5 billion. No surprises on who the key players or key users are, but surgery centers are creeping up into this arena. And who are the main people who are doing the reprocessing? The same companies you know. They reprocess their own single-use devices, which seems interesting to me, and they also buy their competitors' devices and reprocess them and sell them. Is it safe? This is really what you want to know, right? So the CDC says so, the FDA says so, the Association of Medical Device Reprocessors says so, and there's been a lot of data out there, both before 2000 and after the Government Accountability Office stepped in 2008 and wrote a couple white papers and really looked at the data and found that it was. If you dig deep, you're always going to find some, some questionable stuff. You will see that, there's 11 major reprocessors currently and 110 or 120 complex devices that can be single-use devices that can be reprocessed. And they will fail, and they'll note that action was taken and it was either remedied or not, but you can't really dig deeper than that. If you dig a little further in the literature, some groups like to take apart some of the reprocessed ones. And this is actually a really good study, and it raises some important points on, again, my favorite Ligashore, which has some special coatings to tips so stuff doesn't stick to it, right? And so they took 84 reprocessed and 84 new devices, and they broke them down. They didn't just look at them, then they did optical microscopy, then they did electron microscopy, and they're like, wow, there really are some failings in these technically supposed to be reprocessed up to new standard devices. The hemoglobin detection that they did on the tips or inside the devices was also a little bit worrisome. So maybe not all devices in their current manufacturing state can be reprocessed. But why? What's the barrier? Why are we finding ourselves here? Well, liability, right? So these manufacturers of single-use devices have zero incentive to manufacture a reusable device because then they take on the liability. It has to be reprocessed, has to be re-sterilized. They have to make this protocol. They have to be tested on it. If they're single-use, people keep coming back. Their market share goes up, and they don't have any pressures on them. Something that came up in my searching was one of these companies. This actually blows my mind. There are companies out there that will help you make your single-use device more single-use. In fact, they'll teach you how to engineer it so that it will fail better. And so the Ligashore being a key example, they changed the coating that they place on the tips so that it will fall apart after a single sterilization use. And so we call this forced obsolescence, and it should be illegal, but it's actually not. And then there's prohibitory, you might call it predatory contracts with hospitals where suppliers will say, well, if we find out that you're reprocessing our device, we will not sell you the new device. Hospitals, on the other hand, are also a barrier to in keeping reprocessing going forward, right? So on this hand, they're on the other side of it. They have to make sure that their reprocessors are holding up to all guidelines, right? They're having to take on the risk of that safety and that liability on the hospital. Surgeons and staff may not want to use a reprocessed device. They may not know enough about how stringent the guidelines are, and they may say, hey, I don't want that liability. What if I'm in a lawsuit? What if they find out that my Ligashore was reprocessed? Sorry, I keep using the Ligashore. It's just a device I use a lot. And so this is, something that becomes a real reason why hospitals don't go into it. And furthermore, there's actual infrastructure. This particular study here was done at Yale, where they went through all the different stakeholders and really said, there's a lot that it takes to build an infrastructure just to start reprocessing. You need the people in the OR to collect the stuff, to clean it, to get it to the reprocessor, to make sure that everything's on time and put away in a way that can be successfully reprocessed. And it's a lot. So how do we fix this? Well, one solution's reposable. So reusable devices that have disposable portions, like the difficult to clean or easily dulled scissor tips of the laparoscopic shears. There's a lot of different ones out there now. When they do life cycle analysis and look at waste and greenhouse gases and offsetting, it turns out, like for lap chole, the example here, the clip applier, the scissors, and the ports, right? You're somewhere between 60 to 80% reduction in greenhouse gases and waste. It's impressive with just a couple of simple instruments. Maybe we should be rethinking reusable things. I put the surgical gowns up here because I didn't realize just how good the data was on it. It's amazing. With 1,000 uses of a reusable surgical gown in the OR versus that includes all the water to wash them and sterilize them and everything, and you're still 60 to 80% less waste and less emissions and less blue water this is amazing. I don't know why we're not doing this. I did this when I was in medical school. I don't know why we don't do it anymore. Policy, it's always going to be policy, right? Policy has the ability to shape what manufacturers do. We're behind the times. The UK, the NHS, has a whole 2040 net zero carbon footprint policy for their core, and then by 2045 for their extended facilities. And they're so incredibly detailed, it's amazing, down to the lighting and the times of the lighting in the hospital rooms and ways they can cool their buildings and do this and help patient care at the same time. Funding. So if we can't make regulations, maybe we can make incentives. Maybe we incentivize reposables or places that decrease their waste. Or we use our granting system in the US, like the NSF or the NIH funds, and say, hey, build reposable devices or build greener devices where you can get there are precious metals in a lot of these electronic circuits that can't even be extracted due to the glues that are used. Advocacy is going to be, really where we in the room come in. Hospital systems buy, people buy. We are advocating with our dollars. And so then that's our voice. So, we can change the way they act. And if we start, calling out the success stories and we start really pushing on governments and saying, hey, we're going to just focus on, hospitals and on companies that help us to reduce and be more green, we can affect the way manufacturers work. I mean, the customers' dollars are always going to speak when we're talking about advocacy. And finally, you. It always comes back to the single person, right? If this is something that you're passionate about, then it's your voice. And sometimes it's one voice squeaking in a room with a lot of empty chairs, but that's okay. It starts with one voice squeaking. And so go talk to your OR manager, go talk to your OR lead and say, hey, why can't we do one thing? Why could we trial some reusable gowns, right? And I see my red light. So I will say thank you. And it's just a little bit.